A single wooden beam lies half buried beneath centuries of glacial silt and wind-scoured tundra near the edge of what was once Havitka, where the sea used to meet a sheltered cove now choked with ice and stone. The wood is darkened by time, split at one end from freezing and thawing cycles that have come and gone long after its last carpenter set down his tools. It has weathered more than storms. It has endured the slow erosion of isolation, the quiet collapse of a world built on fragile promises of land and sea. This beam was once part of a church wall, perhaps one of two standing in Greenland's southern settlements at the height of Norse presence. Now it rests alone under a sky that never truly warms, where sunlight glides low across the ice fields, like a memory too faint to hold. The ground around it is littered with fragments, shards of pottery shaped by hands long gone, iron nails worn thin from salt and snow, bone tools pressed into soil so hard they would not sink far. There are no names carved here, not on stone or wood, only the silence that settles where people once gathered to light fires and speak in voices now lost. Yet beneath this stillness, something persists, a trace of construction, of care, of effort. The beam was not left by chance. It was placed with intention. And so were the farms carved into the slopes. The stone foundations sunk deep against wind and cold, the careful paths worn down from hill to fjord. This place is not empty. It is full of what has been forgotten, of choices made in winter light, of voyages across open sea, of trade routes that once linked this edge of the world to a continent far away. The beam does not speak, but it remains. And something about its stillness suggests it is waiting for someone who can read how much was sacrificed just to keep standing. In the late 10th century, as Viking longships carved through the North Atlantic under a sky still bruised with the winter storms, a handful of Norse families set foot on an island few had ever seen, Greenland. Not the icy expanse we imagine today, but a land where green meadows stretched along sheltered fjords and reindeer roamed the coastal plains. The Norse called it Greenland, a name both practical and strategic. A bold claim meant to attract settlers by painting a picture of fertility in the far north. Their settlements were built on two main outposts, the eastern settlement near what is now Kangek, and the western settlement nestled farther west along the fjords of present-day Ilulissat. These communities were not isolated experiments, but part of a larger Norse network stretching from Iceland to the Faroes, Norway, and even into northern Britain. The timing was significant. The Norse had already mastered long-distance sea travel and established colonies in remote corners of the North Atlantic during the Age of Expansion. Greenland was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate extension of their world, shaped by ambition, survival needs, and the pursuit of pastureland for livestock. At this time, Europe was undergoing transformation. Monasteries were becoming centres of learning, feudal systems took root in France and Germany, and Christian institutions expanded their reach into Scandinavia. But Greenland's place within this expanding Norse sphere carried inherent risks. The island lay at the edge of a shifting climate system, its fragile ecosystems dependent on sea ice patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal weather. While conditions were relatively mild then compared to later centuries, they were already precarious. Trade connections with Norway and Iceland were vital. Goods like iron tools, textiles, and ecclesiastical items flowed across the storm-lashed seas, while Greenland exported walrus ivory and seal furs, commodities prized in European markets. The settlers arrived not as pioneers of a pristine wilderness, but as part of an evolving transatlantic culture, their survival would depend less on conquest than on balance with nature, with trade routes, and within their own fragile communities. The story of Greenland's Norse settlements unfolds through layers of evidence, geological, archaeological, and textual, that together form a layered picture of life, adaptation, and change. At its heart are the remains of stone longhouses, churches, and graveyards scattered across the fjords of western Greenland. Excavations have revealed foundations laid with care, tools rusted in place, and even fragments of wooden beams preserved in permafrost. These structures tell us not just where people lived, but how they adapted, building low to withstand wind, aligning homes for sun exposure, and reinforcing walls against the elements. In the soil beneath them, layers of sediment hold clues. Pollen samples reveal shifts from grassland to tundra. Peat cores show changes in vegetation and farming pressure over centuries. Scientific analysis confirms what archaeology suggests: climate was not static. Ice core data from deep within Greenland's ice sheet indicates a cooling trend beginning around the 13th century, with longer winters and shorter growing seasons. Tree ring patterns confirm this chill. They show stunted growth in surviving juniper remains near Norse sites. Isotope analysis of animal bones reveals changes in diet, less sheep, more reindeer, and suggests that herds were moved to marginal pastures as pasture land dwindled. Written sources offer a different kind of record. Icelandic sagas describe the settlements with names like the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, chronicling voyages, births, deaths, and even legal disputes. While these accounts reflect Norse life in Greenland, they are not neutral records. Some emphasize hardship or divine judgment, others focus on kinship ties, yet their consistency across decades strengthens their credibility as a cultural chronicle. Together, the physical remnants, climate data, biological remains, and written traditions form a mosaic of evidence. No single source tells the whole story, but when woven together, they reveal not a sudden collapse, but a slow unravelling shaped by environmental strain, shifting trade routes, and choices made over generations. In the wind-scoured valleys of southern Greenland, life unfolded in rhythms shaped by ice and sea. Families rose before dawn to stoke the turf fires that warmed their longhouses, low-ceilinged halls built from stone foundations and layered earth walls, where hearths crackled with driftwood or whalebone. The air was thick with smoke, sharp with salt, and the tang of drying fish. Women chopped mutton in wooden bowls, pounded seal blubber into brittle cakes for winter stores, and wove wool from sheep that grazed on wind-scarred slopes. Children learned to mend nets by lamplight, their fingers numb even inside coarse mittens. Each day was a calculation of how much meat could be spared, of whether the sea ice would hold long enough to reach the fishing grounds, of when the next ship might sail from Norway with iron tools or cloth. A single bolt of woolen cloth meant more than currency. It was warmth, dignity, a sign of connection to a world beyond the fjords. Men crossed treacherous straits in skin boats, hauling nets across freezing currents, their hands raw and chapped. They knew every cove where seals surfaced, every ridge where musk ox might be found. Knowledge passed down through generations who had never known land but ice. There were choices made not with grand strategy, but necessity, whether to risk the crossing in spring when the ice still clung to shore, or wait until summer when storms could sweep a boat from the water. Whether to plant barley on marginal soil that yielded little more than damp straw, or trust entirely to meat and fish. There was no surplus, only balance between need and survival, between pride and pragmatism. They built cairns along the paths, not for monuments, but as markers, reminders of who had passed here before them, a quiet acknowledgement that their lives were measured in seasons, in breaths held against wind, in the slow turn of ice moving across the sea. The central dynamic of Greenland's Norse settlements lies in a fragile equilibrium between survival and sustainability, held together by shifting winds, changing ice, and distant markets. The settlers who arrived in the late 10th century built their lives on a foundation that was always conditional. Access to trade with Europe, particularly through wool, walrus ivory, and seal products, which gave them economic legitimacy beyond subsistence farming. Their survival depended not just on cultivating barley under harsh conditions or raising livestock on thin tundra pasture, but on maintaining a connection to the North Atlantic world, a fragile thread linking them to a system they could neither fully control nor leave. That connection began to fray in the early 14th century as climate patterns shifted. The Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures and expanding sea ice, making voyages more dangerous and less predictable. Crops failed more often, livestock declined. The Norse were not passive victims of this change. They adapted, building stone houses with turf roofs for insulation, shifting grazing areas, even trying to grow oats in the milder coastal valleys. Yet each adaptation came at a cost: labour, time, and diminishing returns on increasingly marginal land. Meanwhile, trade routes faltered as European demand fluctuated, influenced by wars, shifting fashion, and economic instability further west. Walrus ivory, once prized for its use in church carvings across Europe, lost value when alternative sources emerged or new artistic tastes took hold. With fewer ships arriving from Norway, the settlers found themselves isolated not just geographically, but economically. What makes this story compelling is how it reveals a society that was neither doomed nor naive. Its people were resourceful, persistent, and deeply embedded in transcontinental networks. The question isn't simply why they vanished, but why their adaptation failed to outpace the convergence of environmental strain, economic withdrawal, and social fragility. Their disappearance wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, quietly, as generations adjusted to a world that was changing faster than their systems could respond. By the late 13th century, a shift in climate patterns began to press against the margins of survival in Greenland's Norse settlements. The Little Ice Age had already settled into its first deep phase, bringing colder winters and longer ice cover that made sea travel increasingly perilous. While climatic change was gradual, its cumulative effect disrupted long-established rhythms. Voyages across the North Atlantic grew riskier, trade routes less predictable. There is no single date when things turned. Rather, a slow tightening of conditions eroded the foundation upon which the Norse had built their lives. The Greenlanders depended on connections to Norway and Europe for iron, timber, religious relics, cloth, and other essentials, goods that could not be produced locally in sufficient quantity. When storms or ice blocked passage between Iceland and Greenland, supply ships were delayed or lost entirely. The loss of contact with the outside world was not sudden, but it became more frequent and prolonged over time. In response, settlements began to adapt, not by abandoning their way of life, but through intensification of what they already did. In the eastern settlement, for example, there is evidence that herding intensified. Animals were kept longer in barns during harsh seasons, and effort was redirected toward maintaining fewer livestock with greater care. Some archaeologists suggest a shift from mixed farming to pastoralism as a response to diminishing returns on agriculture. But this adaptation came at cost. Less land available for growing grain meant more reliance on meat and dairy, which were harder to sustain in deep winter. Meanwhile, the Western settlement appears to have been shrinking long before its final abandonment. Grave sites show fewer burials, structures fell into disuse or were repurposed. There is no clear record of famine or conflict, but signs point toward a slow attrition, fewer children born, less investment in buildings and infrastructure. Some scholars suggest that the Norse may have begun to migrate southward within Greenland itself, seeking better grazing land, though evidence remains sparse. The transformation was not dramatic, nor did it follow a single path. It unfolded unevenly across decades, some areas held on longer than others, with different strategies emerging in different places. What is clear is that the pressures, climatic, economic, social, interacted in ways that made sustained survival increasingly improbable. The settlements were not erased by catastrophe, but worn down over time, like a rope strained under constant weight until it finally breaks. Despite decades of excavation and analysis, many questions remain unresolved about Greenland's Norse settlements, not because they are unimportant, but because the evidence is fragmentary, layered, and often open to interpretation. One persistent myth is that climate change alone caused the collapse, a sudden freeze that trapped the people in an icebound oblivion. But the data shows no such abrupt catastrophe. The cooling trend was gradual, unfolding over centuries, yet it coincided with broader shifts that made survival increasingly difficult. Still, the precise timing and impact of temperature changes on agriculture remain debated. Different proxies yield conflicting timelines, and we lack continuous records from the settlements themselves. Equally misleading is the idea that Norse settlers were isolated, stubbornly clinging to a failed way of life while the Inuit thrived. The reality is more complex. There was intermittent contact. Evidence suggests trade, even cultural exchange, but how extensive these interactions were remains uncertain. Some scholars argue for peaceful coexistence, others suggest conflict or minimal interaction. Without written records from Norse eyes or detailed archaeological proof of sustained contact, we can only speculate about the depth and nature of their encounters. The role of trade is often romanticized as a lifeline that failed when markets vanished. But what was traded? Where did the goods come from? The supply routes were long and fragile. Even if ships arrived less frequently, it's unclear how this translated into famine or collapse. And while some assume the settlers abandoned Greenland entirely, the absence of skeletal evidence for mass death or sudden abandonment suggests a slow, quiet exodus, perhaps over generations, rather than a single dramatic departure. Finally, there is no definitive answer to whether any Norse descendants survived in remote outposts beyond the historical record. The idea that survivors merged into Inuit communities remains plausible but unproven. We know they were here, we know they vanished. But how, when, and why, beyond what the soil, bones, and ice remember, we may never fully know. The enduring image of Greenland's Norse settlements isn't one of sudden collapse, but of quiet erosion, of choices made over generations that slowly outpaced their own survival. What remains is etched into the landscape: stone foundations half swallowed by moss, a chapel wall leaning against a frozen hillside, the faint outline of a sod-roofed hall, where men once gathered beneath rafters, still bearing traces of old pine pitch. These are not ruins of catastrophe, but of continuity strained beyond its limits. The Norse didn't vanish in one moment. They were absorbed into an evolving world. Their descendants likely endured for generations after the last written record, adapting to a climate that grew colder, to trade routes that waned, and to social structures that could no longer sustain themselves on the margins. Some may have married Inuit families, learned new ways of hunting seal and navigating ice, or retreated inland in search of stability beyond the sea lanes that once connected them to Norway. But what endures most is not a single answer, but the quiet testimony of persistence under pressure. It reveals how human communities respond when their world changes faster than they can adapt. Not with drama, but with endurance, compromise, and slow retreat. The Norse in Greenland were not failures. They were people who lived for centuries on the edge of habitability, making do with what was available until that was no longer enough. This story matters because it resists easy endings. It reminds us that change is rarely a single cause or event. It is layered, gradual, and often invisible in its early stages. The disappearance of these settlements does not signify abandonment, but transformation, obscured by time. And so the lesson lingers not in what was lost, but in how people tried to stay, how they held on as long as it was possible to believe the home could still be found where they stood.